One of the interesting features of the book of Proverbs is this contrast between the bride and the harlot. And we see the bride being personified as wisdom and the harlot being personified as the fool. And we see wisdom, the one who builds her house, and the fool, the one who tears it down. Join me in this new series, What Did Jesus Mean? Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye, and welcome to this series, What Did Yeshua Mean? What did Jesus mean? And we're focusing in on the book of Matthew, the story in Matthew. We're looking at it as a replay of the book of Exodus, but we're also talking about how the book of Matthew really gives us an intimate look at Yeshua and his words, but we really sometimes don't understand what is meant behind those words. And so hopefully as we go through this, things will start making more sense. We left off last time talking about the 5 brides that are listed in Matthew chapter 1, and how each one of them are inserted into the genealogy of Yeshua, his ancestry, and yet all of them had an interesting function in that they served as kind of a harlot, if you will. Tamar, for one. We had Ruth, and we also had Bathsheba, and of course Miriam, Yeshua's mother, all in some way accused of being a harlot, but yet being part of the royal line of King David. Now, as I mentioned at the top, this takes us back to the book of Proverbs, which is a very interesting book because it is all about how one builds a house, how one builds a royal dynasty. If we think about who wrote the book of Proverbs, it's likely King Solomon, and the wisdom that's given to King Solomon to rule likely came from his mother, Bathsheba, or we call her Bat-Sheva, which can mean house of 7 or daughter of 7. And she, of course, is the wife of King David and the mother of King Solomon. And so that wisdom came forth from her, poured out to the king to help him build the house. And that is the purpose of wisdom. Wisdom is in order to build or restore a house. And so we're actually seeing, as in Matthew chapter 1, these 5 brides of the king who all have a component of harlotry, if you will, in it. But the idea is that this restoration, this new creation through these women would bring forth the royal dynasty of the house of King David. It would restore that dynasty. And so within the book of Matthew, we see language of enthronement and coronation, all the stage being set in Matthew chapter 1, as we see the ancestry of Yeshua from Abraham, all the way through to King David. And so this language is the basis of which we see the book of Matthew. Interestingly enough, as we read the book of Proverbs, we also find that wisdom herself was with God, or she was there at the foundation before the foundations of the earth were laid. There was wisdom. So wisdom has a very profound influence on kingship and royalty, that she was there. That wisdom imparted to the king, to his heir, to be able to rule and reign and govern over his people. And I've mentioned in previous programs, as we go through into Matthew chapter 1, everything is divided into this genealogical structure, the ancestry of Yeshua, gives us 14 generations 3 times. So the scripture reads all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the Babylonian exile are 14 generations. And from the Babylonian exile until the Messiah are 14 generations. So it's clear from this scripture that Matthew is very focused in on 3 periods here, and one concluding with the Babylonian exile and the other concluding with the Messiah. It's very focused on this. And of course, there are more generations, and there were generations in between that aren't all recorded, but for whatever reason, these 3 sets of 14, which gives us 42, are what is the focus. And I also mentioned earlier that it is interesting, if we're looking at the pattern of the Exodus, that when the children of Israel are in the wilderness, traveling from place to place before they enter into the promised land, they go through 42 stations. And you can read about that in the book of Numbers. Now, I want to go back for just a second and talk about the Babylonian exile, because clearly that is kind of ground zero in this genealogy that we have in Matthew 1. And just to reiterate that the Babylonian exile was, bar none, the greatest catastrophe for Israel, in that Israel lost her identity and lost everything, especially lost her monarchy. So the kings of Judah had concluded with Zedekiah. He was the last king of Judah, and then that was it, and they went into exile. So we see that exile, if the pattern takes us to Genesis chapter 1, exile is likened to the chaos before creation. Before Israel was given a new identity in the wilderness, she had to pass through the waters on dry ground. And so waters in Scripture in the ancient world came to represent armies or some type of chaos. And so this is what we see, that this, as Israel is brought forth and become a nation and given an identity at the foot of Mount Sinai, we see the same thing happened at the exile. When she returns from exile, what is the thing that she does? Is she rebuilds, Israel rebuilds the temple so that her king has a throne to sit on. Of course, God himself, Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, is to be her king. So the idea of exile is associated with a supreme shame, and that is the loss of identity. That's what happens when a nation goes into exile. And again, the destruction of all of Israel's institutions, and most specifically, the loss of the monarchy or the house of the Davidic dynasty. And really, it boils down to exile meant that the relationship that Israel had with God was completely severed. So the temple that they built was designed to be and house the presence of God. And so with the destruction of the temple, the presence of God was no longer in their midst, if you will. And the same pattern can be seen with Egypt, as the nation under Jacob as tribes, and they go down to Egypt and become a nation in Egypt, but in exile. And so it was when they returned. They came up out of Egypt and through the sea and to the mountain, Mount Sinai, is where their identity is restored. It's very typical of the ancient world. I just, as an aside here, we think post-exile, after the Babylonian exile, and when the children of Israel returned back to the land, that this is probably the time in which the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, were formed. This was probably their final form, the formulation of what we call the Hebrew Bible. We've mentioned quite a few times that I believe personally that the lens of restoration, not only can they be seen through the restoration of the dynasty of King David, but also through the Babylonian exile. And so the exile becomes a very important point in recognizing what's going on with the people, that I think as they were formulating the Bible after they returned, they had a tendency to look at the earlier stories, say in Genesis, through the eyes of the exile. that they would look at those stories, earlier stories from maybe the flood of Noah and on into the stories of Abraham, and how God redeemed and restored them, because they're looking at it from the perspective of having been separated and severed from God and severed from their land. And now they have to figure out a way to rewrite the story to show that God is truly in their midst, present with them, that he cares for them and he has not abandoned them and has not left them. So all of this ends up being a part of what we see in the Gospels in the New Testament. Although when we get to the New Testament and the Gospels, the language shifts from the exile from Babylon, which we see quite a bit in the prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, etc., to the exile that they experienced, the slavery in Egypt. But all of this takes us all the way back to Genesis, as we see a pattern of creation, a pattern of life coming forth out of chaos, of order being restored. Order is restored when the king is seated on the throne. So if you consider an exile, God himself, his relationship severed with Israel, to restore all that, he needed to take his place back on the throne. So that is really the defining message of new creation after exile, is a house built and the king taking his seat on the throne and basically bringing order to the people. Now, so back, that was an aside, back to our Matthew chapter 1, and we do see that Matthew does skip some generations in his outline there. And that's a question you would ask yourself. If you knew the generations, you'd say, well, why did he skip some? Why is the emphasis on these three groups of 14? Again, why are just 5 women mentioned when normally in a genealogy there would be no women mentioned? So this is something the writer of Matthew is trying to communicate with us. He's communicating without actually saying it, but there's an interpretation that the writer is making, and it is our job to try to see that what message he's trying to bring. Listen, there's no way we can know everything that the writer meant. We simply cannot know that. And so as we study and dig and ask questions, that will enlighten the things that the writer is saying, but we'll never know everything. And I think the one thing we have to be cognizant of is it's okay to have more than one meaning. It's okay to see different elements in the story. Now, I'm explaining to you that we can look at the message of the Gospels and say, I see the story of Exodus in there. But someone else might see something different, might have a different lens through which they view the message of the Gospels. And it's okay. There isn't any need or reason to divide people over how they perceive the Gospels or how they perceive Scripture, because the writer intentionally wrote in a way that there are openings there, that people see it's like a giant prism, and people see different facets of that prism. And then if we end up arguing over our facet of the prism is right and yours isn't, then we end up dividing one another. The idea is when we all come together and we talk and discuss and debate and argue to a degree, then maybe we have a fuller picture of what the writer was trying to say. Now, the 3 groups of the 14 don't come out again to the exact same number. It was just meant to show certain points in history. And it's meant to show the divine activity of God through Abraham to David and then to the exile, because everything stopped for them at the exile. There's this giant break after Zedekiah and on up until the children of Israel return to the land and rebuild. And the line would actually go through Zerubbabel. But again, all of this is aiming towards the coming of the Messiah. Just kind of as an interesting aside, David, his Hebrew name, which those of you know Hebrew is a dalet, a vav, and a dalet. Actually, if in what we call gematria, the meaning, the number has value, the letters have value as a number, it comes out to 14. Kind of interesting. So again, this whole thing is evoking to us the biblical narrative of Israel's history. We're seeing it through this genealogy. Now, back to the scriptures here, that it says that these are the journeys I mentioned about the children of Israel journeying through the wilderness. These are the journeys of Bnei Israel, or the children of Israel, when they came out of Egypt by their divisions, under the hand of Moshe and Aaron, under Moses and Aaron. These are their journeys by stages. Israel set out from Ramses on the 15th day of the first month and the first day after Passover. So this is the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, and it's giving us a specific date in which they do that. Now, anybody who knows the Hebrew calendar would know that the 15th day of the first month is the month of Nisan in the spring. And it is at the first of Nisan is the annual new year for the months. And because it's for the months, it's for the agricultural festivals. It's the festival calendar. And so the 15th day would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The 14th was the slaying of the lamb. And in the evening, they would eat the meal, which turned into the 15th. So it's Hag Hamatzah, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day after Passover. So let's just look at this chart for just a second. This is kind of interesting. So we have, again, these three sections, 14, from Abraham to David. And the 14 can be divided up to 7 plus 7. And then when we go to the second one, David to exile, same thing, 14, we can divide that up, 7 plus 7. And the third group of 7 plus 7 would be from the exile to Messiah. Those are our 3 points. So if you look at the 14 plus 14 plus 14, which of course is 42, but also the sevens, how many sevens are there in the 3 14s, if you get it? So the 7 plus 7 3 times. There are 6, a total of 6 sevens from Abraham to Messiah. So why is that important, or what does that even mean? Basically, there are 6 cycles of 7 generations that leads us back to the restoration of the kingdom and the seating of God, Yeshua the Messiah, on the throne. Now, if we think about and go back to the creation week, how many days do we have? Well, we have 6 days, or 6 sevens as well, and the creation rests on the 7th. So 7 in Scripture, although when you ask somebody what does the number 7 mean, they would likely say completion or something along those lines, perfection. But actually, the number 7 all through the ancient world had to do with house building. It meant, and any time you saw sevens, it meant that the temple, if you will, was finished, and the king had taken his seat on the throne. He had defeated all his enemies, and rest had come. So we see 14 generations again with 3 sections, which is a total of 42. Again, the restoration of the kingdom and the king on his throne. Well, the king can't sit on his throne unless he's in the land of which he's supposed to rule over. So as the children of Israel are wandering around in the wilderness, the big deal is when they come back to the land, and you remember they cross over the Jordan. Moses doesn't, but Joshua takes up the charge. And so he, of course, fights on a military campaign to take control of the land. Why? So that they will eventually build a temple, a permanent structure in Jerusalem for the king. And we've compared this now to the 42 journeys from exile to the land, just as we had in the wilderness and just as we have now. The 14 generations, again, 6 sets of sevens. The concept of 7 being house building, king, kingdom, temple, throne. That is a better understanding of what the number 7 has to do. So when we go through the 7 days of creation, the idea of building a house in the 6 days, and on the 7th, the king sat on the throne. Now, the whole of the journeying thing has to do with Passover. Passover becomes a very important key throughout the New Testament. All the Gospels, of course, are going to end on the Passover in which Yeshua was crucified and raised from the dead. So if we go back, I had mentioned in one of our earlier shows, this concept of covenant is very important. We talked about the covenant relationship between the heavens and the earth and God uniting those two spheres. We talked a little bit about the marriage covenant. We talked some about the covenant that a king made with his vassal, or a king would make, or the suzerain made with his vassal, or the king made with his servant, or the father made with his son. This idea, and Passover is the ultimate in a covenant, making a covenant between two parties. Whenever you had a covenant, in order to ratify or seal that covenant, there was always a meal associated with it. So we see this at Passover, of course. The Feast of Unleavened Bread has everything to do with a Passover meal that seals that covenant between the two parties, Chag HaMatzah, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the covenant was further sealed in blood. So, the Passover, it's an agricultural festival, but the Passover, it is not about sin. Okay, this is a big misnomer in the Christian world. The blood was shed, of course, and put on the doorpost, and this is part of the sealing, sealing, of the covenant. But it wasn't about sin. The Passover lamb that was slaughtered and the blood applied was about the restoring of a covenant between two parties. It was about reuniting the relationship. So there were a number of different offerings, but the Passover lamb is more of a fellowship offering than it's not a sin offering. And so we make a grave mistake by assuming that. This is about the restoration of a covenant between God and his people. And so Yeshua's blood, in the way that the children of Israel applied the blood to the doorposts and had a meal, is exactly what Yeshua was doing. His blood essentially being applied to the altar, quote unquote, and sealing the covenant relationship. So it's not about sin. Okay. So with the best example, I guess, is if we go back to Abraham, and you remember the covenant between the parts where an animal is cut in half. That's what a covenant means. Brit is to cut. So an animal was always used so that it spoke to the people making the covenant. You didn't want to be like that animal. Cut in half, the blood drained into the ground, and then the two parties would walk between the halves. And part of this covenant to Abraham was the promise that he would have an heir to the throne, that out of this covenant would be born much fruit and seed would come forth. And what does God say to Abraham? That your seed will be like the number of the stars. And so we actually find in Scripture that stars tended to be associated with rulers, or under the jurisdiction of the king, who was represented as a son, would be his next in line, his rulers. The idea of the stars being the seed being like the stars, and that God promised Abraham he'd be giving him the land to inherit. That was the kingdom he would inherit. Abraham functions in a role as a type of king. So at Nisan 15, the cutting of the covenant at sundown, and associated with the Chag HaMatzah, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we have a meal, we have unleavened bread, and we have wine. Those are things they were confirmation aspects of the covenant. And going back to the story of Abraham, actually the covenant there takes place at Nisan 15 as well, and it says that you and your seed would be oppressed for 400 years. And you can read that in Genesis chapter 15. So Passover is a 7-day festival. Isn't that interesting? Again, house building has to do with 7 days. And so the Passover is kind of a dynasty building event between two parties. To repeat, and Nisan 14, the slaying of the lamb. Nisan 15 was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then Nisan 17 was the Feast of First Fruits. And here we see this 7 thing again. 7 weeks of 7 days will take us to what we call Pentecost, or Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. So remember, we had the 6 sevens in the 3:14s. Hopefully I'm not getting too confusing here. And now we see the 7 sevens, 7 weeks of 7 days, leading us up to Shavuot, Feast of Weeks. But really, we could translate it as Oaths, O-A-T-H-S, Feast of Oaths. And so that was the time of the giving of the Torah, the pouring out of the Spirit we see in Acts chapter 2, and it was a confirmation, once again, of the covenant when the children of Israel stood at the mountain and Moses received the tablets of stone, the governing documents for the new identity of Israel, the nation that had come out of exile and would now become a nation and be given an identity called Israel. And so the Torah was the governing documents. We don't have a whole lot of time left in this particular segment. Everything is connected, one thing to another. And so in the same way that the whole goal of the children of Israel in the wilderness was to get back to the land that God promised his heirs, just like a king promised his son, his heir, his empire, so too God is giving Israel service as a kingdom of priests, and God is promising to them the land, entering the land and ruling and reigning over the whole earth from that sphere. And that's really the definition of the Sabbath rest. So thank you for joining me this week on what did Jesus mean, what did Yeshua mean? And we'll pick it up next time as we go through the book of Matthew. And yes, we will get out of the first chapter. So I hope to see you next time. Shalom.